Hey, good afternoon, and welcome to today's episode of our Boss Talk series. We're live here from the Command Lab at the Public Safety Training Academy to talk about another EMS topic. Today is about the ALS to BLS downgrade process and the company officer's role in that, although there'll be something for everybody, whether you're a paramedic or an EMT or a company officer, though. So we've had three EMS topics in a row, and I would tell you because they've all been very important, meaning that things have been going on around us. We know that pandemic has caused a lot of demand on EMS resources. And the third part, I'll say, of a unplanned series, this wasn't planned in this manner, but this downgrade process is really important. So we have some good folks here today to talk about that. Please make sure if you got questions, get them fired off in the chat. So a couple of things to lead into. If you are a certified chief officer, make sure that if you wish to receive COPDI credit, that you make sure you sign in with your name and your fire service ID, and then do the same at the end. Chief Thomas will make sure that that gets loaded and approved. We want to take a moment to recognize the tragic line of duty loss in Baltimore City that happened 3 days ago, and of course, that's double for us because one of the members from Wheaton Volunteer Rescue Squad was also part of that. So take a moment to recognize those folks. All right, if you follow some of the social media stuff, right, you should be proud of the folks from Wheaton who were part of that procession yesterday, taking firefighter Lakeo's body from the medical examiner to the funeral home. So those guys did a really good job there. Chief Dempsey, he's been one of our presenters before, and I know that's not easy to do. All right, I want to talk about Station 2, right? We try to recognize some things that happen, and people send us stuff from time to time. Interesting event happened on Station 2 a few shifts ago. It was on the B shift. I'd like to recognize Captain Hout and his crew. So we generally don't get involved in weapons, right? Been a lot of violence lately, especially in the first part of this year, especially in the Down County area and also in that Germantown, Gaithersburg area. Fellas came across a pedestrian out in the street, having a seizure. That's what the call was for, right? So the person was incapacitated to a certain extent, needed care. It was an ALS dispatch. The company gets there, they begin to do patient assessment, and lo and behold, this person had a gun, they had brass knuckles with a knife in it, and then like a vaping tool, right? So the least of the worries is the vaping tool. So what they did was they chose to hold the patient down. Right now, it's not like the patient was fighting them or anything like that, right? But they were able to secure both of those weapons away from that person prior to police arrival. It's a little bit out of the box, right? We're not going around saying, hey, you got to disarm people out there. That's really not our job. That's the police job. But when you arrive first and suddenly you find that this person is armed, and what am I going to do about that? I don't know that I can tell you exactly what to do in that scenario. I will say that I think that Captain Hout and his crew took the right action. I'm sure they thought about it really quickly. They had the capability. They just got those weapons away from that person. Then the police were coming anyway, right? It all worked out well. So I'd like to recognize those folks. Chief Fitch brought that to our attention there. Some crazy stuff. You guys got to be careful out there on all of these EMS runs that we're taking. Where do you find past episodes? That's been a question. So you saw a quick 30-second video before. Here's it running again. This is how you find past episodes. So you go to Quick Links, you go to PSTA, you go to CITS Boss Talks, and then that is going to take you to the home page and previous episodes, and there they are, and you can scroll through there to find them, right? We tried to send those links out. The challenge today is we just had an episode yesterday, so they had to share a link for a moment. So yesterday's episode of CITS is on a different link. All righty, and then I have one more thing, and I'll let these folks get started. All right, so look for some information coming out in the near future. I don't know, maybe 60 days out. Our digital media production folks looking to maybe expand that group a little bit. So there should be some information coming out like, hey, if you're interested in being part of this and have some skills, talents in this, whatever, keep an eyeball out. I don't have a good date and exactly what that's going to look like, but we wanted to get that feeler out. One more thing. There was a question about yesterday's relay pumping, and I also promised quick link stuff on that. We will cover that at the end, so hang in at the very end of this. Give me 3 or 4 minutes to talk about the relay pumping question and where the documents are on quick links. All right, so enough of me, right? Today we're here to talk about the ALS to BLS downgrade process. Got a lot of good folks knowledgeable in this. Turn it over to Captain Brady Miller, and he's going to take it from here. Captain Miller.
Chief, thank you very much. Before we begin, let me go ahead and introduce everybody. To my right, we have Captain Mario Weber with BCC, Captain Dement, EMS 704 on the A shift, Lieutenant Schultz, Battalion 4 on the A shift, float, and Firefighter Robinson, Company 12 on the A shift. So welcome and thank you guys for coming here. Before we really dole into today's topic, I did want to touch on two things, really, that we talked about last time with the EMS duty officer. And one of those questions came, it references volunteers, but it says, it would be great to hear them being EMS duty officers, discuss key times when a volunteer A2 or any A2 should call the EMS duty officer. Do you want to touch on that again, Captain?
Sure. Yeah, we did touch on it very briefly. Any time is a good time for a BLS or an ALS clinician who is a volunteer to reach out to the EMS duty officer. Certainly before a call with questions, during a call, we're a valuable resource, and as well as afterwards. Certainly if you're at the hospital and you find that you're there for more than 30 minutes, that's a great time to reach out to the EMS duty officer, but we are a resource for them all the time if they want.
Any provider.
Any provider.
Regardless of your affiliation.
Absolutely. We engage volunteers a lot because we're constantly resetting passwords for everybody.
Yeah.
But we'd much rather meet you on a call and then follow up with you about what your findings were, what your clinical decision making was driven to, and what the outcome of your patient was. Certainly another way to engage the duty officer is ask for some patient follow-ups. Don't just try to guess about what happened with your patient. Just use the link to do a patient follow-up, and you're going to get a lot of feedback and interaction from the duty officer from those types of requests.
It's really important to know that everybody needs to know that we're available to all of MCFRS.
Yeah.
Regardless of affiliation. And then question 2 kind of really spins us into our topic today. What is the EMS duty officer's process when the medic and BLS provider don't agree with a downgrade decision and you are called to make the call? And if you want, let's go ahead and answer that, I guess, or spin it into today's topic, and we'll go from there.
Well, fortunately, this is something that doesn't happen that often. But if it were to happen today, the first thing that I would do is engage the officer. And I would ask the officer, have you followed the downgrade process? So if he's followed the downgrade process, it's going to almost eliminate the disagreement between the BLS and the ALS clinician. If the BLS clinician is uncomfortable with the patient, and they have followed the process. In that process, they've used the downgrade checklist. It's going to provide enough evidence that would support the ALS clinician going along.
His or her decision.
His or her decision, yeah. It's going to support going most often if the BLS clinician is uncomfortable managing the patient.
So let's just maybe start at the beginning of this.
Yeah.
How did we get to this process? How did we get to going, hey, let's make a checklist. Where is that checklist located? How do I access it? Those types of things. And either one of you are certainly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I can speak to that. Thank you,
Okay.
Captain Miller. I appreciate the opportunity to be a part of this today. So it's a really good question, right? And in my mind, this is the story of where, you know, the county's QA, QI process was able to, you know, transition from findings in terms of what it is that we were seeing in terms of either bad outcomes or potentially just bad downgrades, right? Which is, and what do we mean by bad downgrades? That means we are downgrading patients who aren't appropriate for downgrade because they're ALS patients. They either require ALS assessment, they require ALS treatment. They're just not appropriate. They're not BLS patients, right, for downgrade. And so, you know, it's a longer story when you talk about the transition in terms of the county's delivery model to putting a lot of the ALS delivery off of non-transport units, right? But once we were at that point, we were down the road in terms of that transition. We started to see some of those things, right, in terms of the bad downgrades. And so we really started to think about what were the contributing factors to those downgrades, right? Because we could certainly go to each individual provider and say, bad job, right? And we're gonna do something to you, but that's not really what it is that we were trying to get at. We were trying to understand systemically, right? What is it that was driving this? Because it wasn't just individual providers, it wasn't necessarily bad providers. So what we realized was the contributing factors to bad downgrades were, one, we weren't engaging these patients at the ALS level, right? And so these were patients where, and we talked a little bit about this before we started today, we just sort of looked at them and said, that's not an ALS patient, so I won't even engage at the ALS level. Because we didn't engage at the ALS level, we weren't assessing these patients at the ALS level. And what that ultimately meant was we were not identifying high-risk chief complaints. We weren't identifying and recognizing ALS patients. And so what that ultimately meant is we were making bad downgrade decisions, and then worse, we were starting to see bad outcomes. And ultimately, we ended up seeing the worst outcome that we could potentially have for a patient as a result, not necessarily as a result, but associated with a bad downgrade, right? So we knew we had to do something. And as we were looking again systemically, what we realized was, well, what are some of the things on the system, right, in terms of how we manage this risk? Because it's really about risk management. This is risk to everyone. And so we did not at the time have a standardized process for downgrades. And so that created a lot of risk for the system, right, in terms of what it is that we were doing. We had very minimal guidance to providers. And so we, you know, and Dr. Stone will tell you this, downgrades are a thing that we do. It's within the scope of the provider. And frankly, it's appropriate for a tiered system. But we didn't have a lot of guidance to providers in terms of how to do that. And so then the issue became, well, that creates risk to the providers because we're asking them to do things without the proper guidance to do that effectively. And then the last thing was we were seeing bad decision makings and we were seeing bad outcomes. So all of that gets to what is it that we ultimately ended up doing? We ended up establishing a process, right, that really gets at the issue of we need to engage at the ALS level, we need to assess at the ALS level, we need to identify high risk chief complaints, and then we need to communicate that, right? We need to have a timeout where we're able to, at the ALS level and the BLS level, make sure everyone is on the same page in terms of what is appropriate for this patient when it comes to a downgrade. We wanted to provide guidance, and so we developed this checklist, and we also validated this checklist, right? So we did an internal QA/QI study here in the county to look and see, all right, these are the things we think might help providers identify high-risk chief complaints in patients that are not appropriate for downgrade. Let's actually take a look at that, look at what it is that we do when we compare that to someone in the QA/QI office actually looking at these and seeing where there's good concurrence in terms of where they identify a good downgrade versus a bad downgrade. And then the last thing was, you know, in terms of the process, there was also the documentation piece, right? And so the checklist is both a tool for the provider, but it's also a way of documenting what it is that we do because, as with everything else, we have to document, particularly when it comes to things that involve risk management. Refusals are an analog to this in the context of what it is that we do out in the field, right? There's a lot of risk that we accept when we do patient refusals. We document those. We have a checklist associated with those. We provide guidance. We have a process. So that is how it is that we came to where we are today in terms of having this process with the timeout, with the checklist, and sort of where it is that we've landed.
Can I ask you, was it coming from BLS, and it might have been coming from both, was it coming from BLS providers that weren't recognizing conditions or symptoms or whatever, or was it coming from ALS providers that didn't assess thorough enough to realize that, hey, yes, this is an ALS call, or was it a combination of those?
You know, it was a combination. That's a really good question because this downgrade process has two pieces to it, right?
Yeah.
Because there are the patients that have ALS dispatched and you actually have engagement with ALS, and then there are the patients who don't see an ALS provider. We don't have the engagement because the BLS provider says, you guys are good right before, and I apologize for messing with the mic, but you guys are good. You don't even have to show up at the scene, right? And so what I would say in terms of remembering where this all started from, it was more on the ALS side where we were seeing patients go to hospitals with BLS units that weren't appropriate. And so we were hearing it primarily from the hospitals, right? And them coming to us and say, hey, this patient came BLS. We tried to ask a bunch of questions, tried to figure out what assessments had been done en route, and what we were told was, we're not paramedics, we're just a BLS unit. We're not ALS, and so we didn't do any of those things, didn't do any assessments, didn't do any of the interventions because this patient was downgraded BLS.
Okay.
So basically, what the charge nurse hears from the BLS clinician is that there was an ALS clinician on the scene, and he assessed the patient and decided that the patient did not need to be transported as ALS.
Okay. What about the BLS provider that, hey, this is a drunk person, or I believe it to be. I put him in, and then we go downhill from there.
That's called prejudging. We would like to think that the individual is drunk, but
Yeah.
maybe they're not. Maybe they are, in fact, having a medical emergency. So when we start to prejudge or say, I've run this patient before, and I went and it was BLS, or I went and I didn't do anything. These are all some of the pitfalls of poor downgrades, is not engaging the patient, not communicating well, not documenting well, all of the things that Mario mentioned that ultimately end up with a BLS provider with a patient that they should not be with by themselves.
Okay. So before we dole a little further into that, I'm going to turn to our paramedic. Can you tell me some of the things that you encounter, positive and negative, either, it doesn't matter, with the downgrade process?
Well, in regards to this checklist, most oftentimes, and having joined the department recently, it wasn't a part of our training to bring the computer with us. And as a professional paramedic, I'm focused on my patient, so the computer's pretty much the last thing on my mind. So what ends up happening is our assessment occurs within inside of the dwelling, whether that be a high-rise, mid-rise, anything like that, and the computer's nowhere to be found. So by the time we have our conversation with the BLS providers, the checklist basically is something that we have talked about. Also, I have the luxury of having some guys that I'm pretty familiar with and also pretty confident within their abilities in transporting that. The checklist doesn't necessarily seem necessary, and it's not a situation in which it's like we're going back and forth. Do you want me to go? Do you think I should go? Because if there's any uncertainty with anybody that I transport with, I'm going to go regardless.
So is it more of a verbal?
Yeah, and they're watching.
Hey, I know it's on the chat. I know the list exists. I know what's
Right.
on it.
And
let me talk to you, and if I'm comfortable and you're comfortable, go.
right, and the guys that I work with are watching me do the assessment, so they'll be able to look at the monitor and be like, "Yeah, that's not right," or "This person doesn't look right." They already have an idea of what I'm thinking.
I can tell you, I look at the monitor every time. I have no idea what it is.
But some guys, they're real familiar. They might see something and say, "Oh, are you going with us?" Or it's something that's obvious, and if it's not, that conversation is had, and it comes down to basically ending, are you good? And they'll say, most of the time that doesn't have to be said, but if you're running with somebody that's not
So
familiar.
would you say the majority of the time you're not completing the checklist, or on the EPCR, you're not doing the checklist?
Me personally,
Yes.
in the medic unit house, it's different anyway, but yes, most of the time I'm not completing the checklist.
Tell me why.
Like I said,
That's what we're here to talk,
So
right?
what he described was the perfect scenario. It's called a combination approach to assessing the patient. That's what you want to happen. You want both the BLS and ALS clinician to do a combined assessment. So in fact, what's happening is you're going through the checklist as you're assessing your patient. So it's in fact getting done.
Right.
It's not during the timeout period.
Right.
So at the end of your assessment, the decision is already made whether you're going or not. And if it's a situation where you're not going, then the BLS clinician is going to be a lot more comfortable because he or she was involved in your hands-on assessment.
Right.
You can't downgrade a patient that you don't touch.
Right.
You literally have to engage the patient, communicate with the patient, get as much information from the patient to support whatever decision that you make.
That's correct. And this also has a lot to do with the landscape of where we work. Is typically we're either going to be on the scene at the same time. It's not going to be a situation where the wagon gets somewhere and we're waiting on the transport unit, or the ambulance is getting somewhere and waiting on a medic. It's typically going to be within the same, we're walking in together kind of thing. So I understand that there's different areas in which you might be on a wagon waiting for a transport unit, or vice versa. So for me personally, that's how it typically works out.
So is there a technology component that?
The times in which I may have went to this checklist, it was a situation of, hey, we completed this upstairs, and now we're going to log this on to go through it, and it's added minutes on top of being on scene for however long you'd already been there.
So the perception is delaying patient transport.
Correct. And typically, like I said, the familiarity is already there, in which is like, all right, I saw this. It's rare that you come in contact with somebody. It's like, I'm not comfortable. And if a situation for me personally, like if our ambulance leaves from quarters and says, hey, I want to upgrade, I'm going with that in every intention that I'm going anyway, because they took the time to call and us to respond. So I'm not thinking, let me go in here with the checklist to get out of doing this. I'm going to already go. So typically that's what happens.
Okay.
On our side.
So do you ever, since you don't use the checklist, like
Every time.
or every time, do you ever find yourself in a situation where you get back in your unit and you think, maybe I should have gone? Because the checklist helps to alleviate that uncomfortable feeling, because I'm sure as an officer, when a call is dispatched at ALS 1, and we all know that all ALS dispatch calls don't end up being ALS. And that's okay. Our system is designed that way. However, do you ever find yourself wondering, hey, that call was dispatched to ALS 1 and I still got my medic in the back? Like, as an officer.
So let's address the lieutenant, newly promoted, right?
Right.
Float, so you go all over the county. Do you encounter, and we're going to take one step back and then move to there. Do you think our medics are utilizing the checklists in the EPCR?
I would say yes, maybe not physically using the EPCR, but I think that a lot of them are well versed in probably what it says and what they should be thinking. Whether or not they take that time out, sit down with the checklist, consult with the BLS clinician, I wouldn't
okay
say,
to be honest.
I wouldn't say all the time, but I think that in my experience, they do the right thing. I don't think that any of them are trying to skate out of.
And I truly believe.
I truly do feel that way.
But do you ever, being 1st Battalion born and bred, do you feel like some of your ALS clinicians use the proximity of the hospital as a way to say, you're going to be fine. You're 5 minutes from the hospital.
I honestly, I wouldn't even
night.
say that the ALS, in my personal experience, I wouldn't, being a BLS clinician, I wouldn't say that the ALS providers use it. I would say as a BLS clinician, I was doing that more than they were.
Okay.
Because I would put them in service knowing that, well, I could just get to the hospital in the time that they're going to do whatever it is that they do.
in the time this program opens.
In the time this program opens, they conduct their assessment.
Sure.
I'm comfortable with this. I'm just going to go.
And that was
So I would say that the ALS clinicians were not using it to get out of it. I was using it to not utilize them. Because, like we talked about before, and this is just complacency, you were running the same people, you were running the same type of call, and my callousness towards these types of things developed an attitude in which, I'm going to be fine with this. I don't feel like it was the ALS putting that pressure on me. It was more the other way.
Sure.
And I think this goes to the pitfalls that Captain Knapp was talking about, right? Which is, I don't think it's an issue of good or bad intent, right? Because I think for the most part, our providers want to do the right thing, right? It's a matter of, okay, how do we do it consistently every time in a standard way, right? And so it's difficult to do that when paramedic Robinson knows what he's doing, the folks around him know what he's doing, but there are a lot of other folks in this system, right? How do we make sure that everyone is doing this in the same way? The documentation piece is huge, right? How do we document the risks that we're accepting when we downgrade patients, right? Because that's big too in terms of if something does happen later on, how we can go back and say we did this in a deliberate, thoughtful way, standard way, using guidance to inform our decision making, using all of the available information. And then, to your point in terms of, the pitfalls around proximity to the hospital, there's a reason why this was MRC driven, right? Because we had seen, and we'd seen these in reports, right? I could see the hospital on the horizon, right, as a reason to downgrade, and not having, again, good outcomes. That's why they end up in the MRC. There was nothing I could do for this patient as an ALS provider in terms of interventions, and so I let them go BLS, right? Not really what it is that we want out of our ALS providers, because assessment is a huge piece of what we do, and frankly, it's something that the hospital will also really benefit from. And so for all of those reasons, what happens is those are the things that take good intent from providers wanting to do the right thing and potentially result in still even having good intent in potentially bad outcomes or bad decisions in terms of downgrades because of those reasons that are going to trip you up. They're essentially what is tripping up medics who are trying to do the right thing. And so, what does this checklist do? What does this process do? It does create a bit of safe harbor for folks. We've talked about the risk to providers from not having guidance, right? And so we have a tool that you can use. And ultimately what that means is when we did that validation study, we found that it's really good at telling you when patients are okay for downgrade, not as good as telling you you shouldn't downgrade this patient. And what that means is if you go through this process, go through that checklist, and it says good to go, you're in a pretty good spot. And that's something that even if there's, we can't control all outcomes, right? There are things that are always outside of your control, but there's a bit of a safe harbor for the medics to say, I went through the process, took into consideration all the factors that I needed to make a fully informed decision based on assessment, based on vitals, everything that we need to do to make good downgrade decisions, as opposed to, I kind of know what's in this, I kind of know what to look for an ALS patient, but that maybe missed some things because I didn't have something that I could use, and then also, I was a bit tripped up because it was 2 a.m. and the hospital was on the horizon. I didn't think there was really anything I could do, and that's where we find medics in a bad spot, which is not where we want to see them from the MRC perspective.
How has the change in transfer of care times played into the importance of this?
Well, I think it's a really relative question because our mindset as ALS clinicians is to treat the patient through the door. That means whatever interventions that we do out in the field, the patient is still benefiting from our interventions when they're still on our cot 20, 30, up to an hour later. They're still benefiting from what the ALS clinician did. So with the transfer of care times creeping up there, just last night we had a unit at a hospital for close to 2 hours. Luckily enough, that was a very low acuity patient. But when you have that patient that's kind of borderline, do you really want your patient uncomfortable on your cot when it was something that could have been done ALS-wise? It goes back to, relieving human suffering. That's what we do. So I think the mindset is, from an ALS clinician standpoint, what is it that I can do to make this patient feel better from not the time they get to the hospital, but until the time.
Now we need to include the additional block
until
of time.
The hospital treats this individual. Not until we get to the door, but until the doctor prescribes medication for this patient.
Do you think we're doing this?
We are doing it well. We can do it better. So,
are you taking those into your considerations now? I mean, right, the landscape has changed.
For sure, yeah. That in the first battalion, we're definitely
2
doing
hours
that.
at
Yeah,
White Oak.
we're considering that. But yeah, definitely on a pain management scale, if you can start a line and maybe push something for somebody that's in pain, knowing that whatever they're going through. I've sat with a patient with a obviously broken arm for an hour plus in certain hospitals. So you go in there with that understanding of, whereas before you might say, are you going to be seen? They're going to give you something better, whatever the case may be.
So we're adding this to our treatment thought process. I don't know, am I using the right words?
And that has to be built into the downgrade process. And when I say process, I mean the ALS clinician, the BLS clinician, and that second medic that's driving the engine today on an ALS 1 call. They're part of that process as well. But certainly, what we want to do now is we really want to incorporate the engine company officer into that process.
Yeah, I was going to ask, how does Captain
Yeah.
Miller, how does
Because-
Lieutenant Schultz,
because Captain,
where do I fit in?
Because Captain Miller is going to say, I'm not an ALS clinician. I don't know. I trust my guy. I trust my girl. You know, whatever it is. So I'm not going to second guess them. If they get back on the unit, then what this literature is saying is, as a unit officer, have you considered just in the intercom saying, hey, how did that process go? How did the downgrade process go?
Right.
And that reiterates the importance of ensuring that it in fact happened. So then you can be comfortable with the fact that you're taking your medic back on a call that was dispatched ALS, and that's absolutely fine. But we have to get out of the mindset of thinking I'm a suppression officer or I'm not an ALS clinician, so I'm not in a place to question this process. You are. You may not be in charge of the actual patient's care, but you are in charge of that incident. The process is a part of the incident.
Okay.
Is that right?
I think that's right, sir.
So now let's kind of, and is this we can certainly discuss this that's up. Chief, did you have a question before we move?
I do. So this is Chief Davis. You don't need me on camera, but so I just wanted to hop in on that. I sit on the MRC also, right? And part of my role is I take the command officer spot. So I look at it more from supervision, right? So when I see the things that we talk about, my first question in many of the cases is what did the company officer do? Was there a company officer there, and what did they do, regardless of whether they were a ALS certified company officer or a BLS? It doesn't matter, right? So if you're a lieutenant or a captain or whatever, and something bad happens, my first question is going to be, what did the officer do? And sometimes those answers are, wow, I don't believe that that's what happened, right? And there's other times where, hey, the officer did. The vast majority of the time, our people are doing really good stuff. I'm impressed with the stuff I see. It's like, wow, they did this, they did that. That was really amazing, right? We do really good stuff, and we've had a lot of good things on there, but we would not be talking about this today if it wasn't really important. We wouldn't be.
Yeah, certainly.
We'd be talking about second alarm fire on Maple Avenue, right? This stuff is really important, so every company officer watching this needs to be paying attention to this.
So do you want to kind of maybe start with the process? Like we have the slide up.
Mario,
You know, we have
see
these
that?
great drills that Chief Kaufman or whoever generates. I think they come from him. But why don't we talk about the process and then maybe
Sure.
talk about some issues or how to overcome some of the problems associated with it.
Yeah, happy to speak to it. So, you know, we've got the Chief's General Order, and I've got it
Right
here
here.
to refer to it, but yeah, and I've got it here too.
Oh,
Thank you, sir.
okay.
Appreciate it. But, you know, we start with the ALS dispatch, right? And one thing to keep in mind is we know a couple things about the ALS dispatch. We know that every patient that we get dispatched to as ALS is not going to be an ALS patient, right? But we also know that there's a validated system, right, and framework for why that patient is dispatched ALS, that at the very least puts the burden of proof on the provider to figure out why was this patient dispatched ALS and why are they not ALS, if that's the direction we want to go, right? We're looking for that high-risk chief complaint. We're not going into a call saying, these patients aren't ALS. We're trying to think about, okay, I'm coming to this patient, it has an ALS dispatch because there's some sort of element to the complaint that made it ALS. So how do I, being mindful of that, think about whether this patient is actually ALS or BLS? So something to keep in the back of our mind. The requirement to engage, that is both for the ALS providers and the BLS providers, right? And you brought this up right at the beginning of the session, which is, you know, there are going to be instances where the BLS provider is really making this call for the medic, right, but not even letting them engage with the patient. And so on both ends of it, you have to have engagement at the appropriate level, at the ALS level. There's something we've seen, in the MRC where we have ALS 2 calls where ultimately at the end of the day what the patient got was ALS 0 because neither of the ALS providers engaged that patient at the ALS level. So that's that requirement to engage at your level. The assessment piece is huge. You can't make a decision unless it's an informed decision, particularly when you're accepting risk on behalf of yourself, on behalf of the patient, on behalf of the system. So what does that mean? It means you have to really understand what the complaint is. You have to get a really good history. You have to get a set of vitals. All of those things are going to inform a good decision. And so once you've done all of that, then you get to that yes or no. Am I going to downgrade that patient, right? And then you're going to have that timeout portion of this, which is really where there's a lot going on these calls, right? And there's a lot of people on the scene. So how do you make sure that, and it's on the screen here, right? We have that exchange of information. We're going to pause and we're going to say, okay, let's go through this checklist to make sure they're a good candidate for downgrade. You're going to think about what that means for the patient, right? Are we going to send this patient to the hospital in obvious pain or some other way where, to use Dr. Stone's words, we can just make their life better, their situation better? And so, it's intended to be a collegial discussion. It's intended to be bidirectional, right? The BLS provider is providing input, the ALS provider is providing input. And at the end of that, what we want is that consensus decision, right, as to whether or not that decision is appropriate. And again, we're really trying to empower and support the ALS provider by giving them something that they can rely on as guidance, and then also the BLS provider, right? Because we talked about this earlier. It can be uncomfortable for the BLS provider to tell an ALS provider, "Hey, I'm not comfortable with this patient," because everyone wants to shoulder their load, right, in this system. But at the same time, we want to be able to provide them with something where they can say, you know what, on the basis of this factor, I'm not comfortable accepting this patient, and that's something that we're going to seek to support as a system in the same way we're going to seek to support the ALS providers. And so once we've done all of that, right, and we've got the checklist done, because again, it's that documentation piece, that's where you're going to be in a really good position in terms of the downgrade, if that's the direction you choose to go.
Okay. So how do I, as a captain, as a unit officer, as a lieutenant, how do I help this process? In having that blunt conversation?
Be involved and have that uncomfortable conversation with the ALS clinician. And the more often you have that conversation, the less uncomfortable it becomes, because then your ALS clinician knows that they are working with an officer who is as engaged, although they may or may not be an ALS clinician. They're still overarching responsible for that incident and the wellness of that patient. So I encourage that conversation to happen every time. Certainly, if you leave that ALS 1 call with all 4 people, everybody on that unit should be comfortable with the fact that the ALS clinician is going back to the station with you.
Everybody really on the event, not just
everybody.
Yeah, right?
and especially the folks that are on the ambulance, because they're going to spend another hour with this patient. And like Mario was saying, documentation is key. It's so important, as important as the process itself. So if we're following this process each and every time, it's going to spin us in a direction of making really good, sound decisions that work in the favor of not only the patient, but the provider as well as our system.
Okay. So problems, really, and I don't know how to even call it a problem, I just want to call it an issue that you brought up earlier. The computer is down in the ambulance, and now there's a lag time between you completing that portion of the report, I guess, and the ambulance being able to leave. How do I overcome that issue?
The EPCR is a tool, no different from a tool that you would take to the fire ground. When you go to a working incident, you don't leave your tools in the unit, you take them with you. The EPCR is a part of a tool that is essential in the documentation process of the patient. So there's always somebody that's not, engaging the patient. Hey, here's the EPCR, can you start to enter some stuff? And it's simple stuff. Here's the person's identification, just enter their name, their birth date, their address, things like that. That all helps. It cuts down on the amount of time that you're spent documenting at the hospital. The more you can do there on the scene, the better it is.
What about if we climb back into engine 702 and the paramedic says, "Oh shit, I forgot to do the downgrade"? Is that overcomable?
Of course. A few ways. Initially, I would ensure that we didn't get to that point. The process needs to start with the ALS clinician as soon as they get there. So again, what I prefer is that combination approach where all this information is being exchanged throughout the incident. So both the ALS and BLS clinician are sharing their assessment findings as they go, as well as gaining all the necessary information so that they can make the best decision for that patient. I think, again, that EPCR is a tool that you just got to have it with you.
And what I would add to that, and this is what Paramedic Robinson was talking about earlier, you can still get through this process. You can still accomplish what it is that we want to happen, right? You got to engage ALS patients, ALS, right? You got to assess your patients at the ALS level, at the appropriate level, right? And then you got to have what Chief Burns now would say is the meeting of the minds between the ALS and the BLS providers. And so if you don't have the PCR for that, certainly I spoke about the fact that we want to do this in a standardized way consistently every time, but you can still do it. And what that means is if you get to back to the engine and say, didn't actually document that, right? The EPCR doesn't stop you from doing every other part of this, including the timeout, right? And going through the factors and checklist, even if you necessarily don't have them in front of you in the EPCR checklist. And so, what does that mean? It means the documentation piece is going to be a little bit more of a challenge, but you can still do your operational support documentation, right? And that's what we used to do before, right? On every one of these patients, you'd have to then document from the ALS perspective your operational support that you provided. And so now, if I remember correctly, you can do the checklist, and that obviates the need to do that operational support. But if you don't do the checklist, now you got to go and do that operational support, and that's going to be your opportunity to document what you did, which you didn't need the EPCR for. But to Captain DeMent's point, it's a tool.
What kind of things are on the checklist there, Cap?
The checklist provides you with, you're revisiting your entire assessment findings. So it looks at blood pressure, looks at findings,
parameters with
each
of these,
and
above or below. Or
when you start checking these boxes, then you're like, maybe this isn't a good idea. You know what? This patient appears like they've been stable, and in this situation, maybe they've been like this for a couple of days. They've been gradually getting worse. I don't think anything is going to happen catastrophic between now and the next 20 minutes. But if you go down the checklist, these things are going to pop up, and it's going to spell out that this is probably not going to be a good downgrade, or it may spell out the fact that it would support a downgrade. The downgrade is something that Montgomery County Fire Rescue supports. We realize that it's a tool that can be used. It's a privilege for the clinician to be able to downgrade a patient because, again, we know that not all of these patients are going to be ALS. Mm-hmm. So good clinical decision making, good information sharing, good documentation all lead to a good decision on whether the ALS clinician goes or not. But all of those things have to be communicated, and in this process, we have to have that open air communication where the timeout is kind of happening consecutively with our assessments.
Meaning we need to take a more concerted effort.
Yeah. And
the two of us.
And the two of you at some point need to have that uncomfortable, question.
I don't think it has to be uncomfortable.
It doesn't.
I think
really
it could just be something as simple as like, hey, you good with this? As an officer, I don't have to come to you and necessarily interject myself into what you're doing, but I can say like, hey, are you sure about this? Like, kind of that moral,
sure,
check up.
But
like,
what happens when you, as an experienced officer, not so sure about?
Well, I'll give you the opportunity to come to that conclusion on your own.
Right.
By asking you like, hey, is this the right thing? But at the end of the day, we do have a responsibility, as you talk, to provide the best we can for the patient.
Right.
And if I then have to intervene, but I generally feel like we talked about before that our paramedics do the right thing 99.9% of the time, and fortunately I haven't not had to come to that yet. But sometimes it is good to have that accountability to say like, hey, I don't exactly know what's going on, but like, are you sure you're comfortable with that?
Right.
And sometimes at 2 o'clock in the morning, that might be all you need to hear to be like,
Check yourself.
Yeah.
maybe I
my.
should. Maybe I'm, not thinking straight. This is our 20th call to shift. I'm not, which, as we said, burnout has a lot to do with it too, about, not thinking clearly and getting complacent.
So that process really needs to start at the very beginning of the incident and follow its way through its entirety. Because once the clinician gets in the back of the engine to go back, it's kind of like a wash. And then you're like, not so sure about that, but he's the medic or she's the medic,
Right.
and I'm not. So what we need to do is become comfortable being uncomfortable asking these types of questions.
What do you, if I'm asking you that? What do
In
you,
regards to the company officer question?
yeah, I'm not a paramedic, you're a paramedic, and now do you feel that I'm questioning your skills and abilities, or maybe you?
No, I'm not beyond reproach. I mean, everybody can have, make a mistake or not be in their right state of mind, and might just, that coming from an officer will always make you think, well, maybe I should go. Or,
It's not like we're trying to scare you.
exactly. Especially if your officer isn't a medic, and then if they got to say something, then you're like, all right, I'm gonna go ahead and get back off.
Do you feel like you just going sometimes helps, or it doesn't? Or does it irritate you if you go when you don't feel like you had to go?
Me personally, I don't like making it seem as if I'm so far beyond a BLS provider. I want them to be competent in their skills, especially if it's within their realm of our scope of them to be able to transport the patient. So that's me personally. So me going along, sometimes I like just to get out the files, even if I don't need to go. But also, you just want to consider being available for the area in which you serve sometimes, keeping a conscious mind of what's going on around you. In addition to also understanding the differences of having 4 people on an engine company if there's a house fire. There are differences that are made in that aspect as well. But no, I'm never not comfortable going if somebody asks or annoyed or anything like that.
Chief, I think you had a question.
Yes, I have a few comments. First comment is from Chief Kaufman, and he's just tailing and chiming in on the discussion you're currently having. We need to get away from officers asking, are you good with this? Be specific. Did the patient meet the downgrade criteria is something he would ask.
Oh, more specific wording. Really, be direct.
And I'll allow you guys to comment on that before we go to the next one if you want.
And again, that's what I've been kind of driving towards. That process does involve some direct questions. Is this a good downgrade decision? It is a privilege. You have a right to make that, but can you support your clinical decision making based on the fact that you've engaged this patient, you've gathered the information, you've assessed this patient, and by all means, you have the tools in order to do a little more than that BLS clinician. Have you used these tools to add to your decision making?
Yeah.
So putting the monitor on that patient, is that going to impact whether you go or not? Absolutely not. And that's kind of out there, or it has been. Well, if I put the patient on the monitor, then I'm committing myself. That is absolutely not the case. It's another tool that you're using in your assessment.
And that's a perfect example of a change that was made because what we want to prioritize is making fully informed decisions. We don't want to prioritize just making sure medics go to the hospital with patients. So there was some question years ago around, hey, if I do that, right, is that an ALS intervention, put that patient on monitor? And what we were seeing from the MRC perspective is patients with STEMIs were going to the hospital without having had 12 leads done, when the presentation really called for someone to take a look using the EKG, right? And what was driving that? A part of that was that confusion, and you're making that decision particularly in 2 in the morning. This patient's borderline, but I don't want to commit myself to transport by putting the 12 lead. And so what we said was, no, do the 12 lead. Get all the information that you need to make a good decision. And that decision can be based on all the information, based on all the factors, this patient is appropriate for downgrade.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm sorry.
And it also supports your transfer of care when you're with that charge nurse and you're explaining what transpired. then you can say, well, the ALS clinician did this, this, and this, and I may not know what that all means, but it'll be available in my documentation.
Yeah.
So it supports and it makes that ride back to the station a lot more comfortable when you've covered all of these additional bases.
Yeah, you feel like you've given what you need to give. Second
So
question,
Chief Kaufman added to his statement earlier, was the downgrade process done, was in the question.
Yeah.
Dr. Stone made a statement, the checklist is no different from safeguards that are used to make sure surgeons do not cut the wrong organ. If patients deserve a culture of patient safety, EMS medicine has a role in that.
okay, thank you.
And we do have one more question
Certainly.
in the queue. All right, what if the MAR, I assume that's Mutual Aid Rescue AMBO, from a different county has left and you are now with the engine EPCR, you don't have the name, signature from the BLS, and do not have the name or date of birth and phone for that patient. So it's more of a question kind of thing here.
So,
Like you don't have any demographics, how do you conduct the
A downgrade?
without having it?
Yeah, because even for the operational support part of the report, you generally need some identifying information for, it's tricky. Operationally, I mean, I don't know that that's the norm.
So
right?
let's help me understand the question. I don't know if I got I apologize, Chief. What was the
So
question?
the mutual aid ambulance has left with all of the demographics. How do you conduct a downgrade
So
without having it,
Montgomery County AFRA
say, out of
PG ambulance.
Correct.
Yes, they have left.
Okay.
Left the scene, and you're now on the engine with your EPCR.
Okay.
But they left with that information.
Back to
Do
the
not have
technology kind of
the
side
name,
of it.
signature, BLS, all that stuff, date of birth. You do not have that information. It wasn't posed as a question there. It was more of kind of a comment. I think they're kind of.
To help us overcome some of the technology issues that I hear from the field. We talked about this last shift at the lineup table. And the feedback that I heard from the providers, BLS and ALS, was, hey, this computer takes forever.
Right.
I'm adding 6 minutes to the call.
Right.
I don't want to do that. So, that's why we're not doing them. Is that an overcomable?
It is. One of the things that needs to take place is, when you're checking out your unit first thing, you should, the person that's getting off should log off of the computer. And then you should then log on the computer. And sometimes it takes restarting the computer, which allows the computer to work faster. You got to get rid of all the cookies and stuff that don't need to be there, and it then allows the EPCR to work faster. I get it. I know I've witnessed the fact that it takes 10 minutes, to get the necessary documentation up so that you can document properly. If you're working with a clean EPCR that you can establish at the beginning of your shift, then it will take away that additional time it takes for the documents to load.
So that'll help a little bit.
It helps a great deal.
Was there an?
Yeah, so they added on to their statement before. So how do you complete the downgrade process, given that information I just read?
Yeah, I think it's going to be, so one, this isn't specific to downgrades, right? This is really about how you submit an EPCR report without having information, and that happens in other contexts. And so, for me, right, that can be the patient that you get to that isn't going to provide any information to you, right? Or maybe unconscious. Unconscious, you're going to have something at the hospital, but it may be a patient that doesn't provide anything, and then you don't abandon the patient, they essentially abandon the call, right? But it's not a patient necessarily where you can just sort of say this was good intent. So these are sort of the tricky situations that we get to when it comes to the actual reporting piece. There's not going to be an easy solution. What am I going to do in that situation? I'm going to call Captain Dement, right? I know in the past what I've done is use triage tags, right? And essentially use a triage number, and I forget what the process is because it's been a while since I've encountered one of these situations, but it's going to be one of those where it's not the norm. It's not the rule. You're going to encounter them, and you're not going to get necessarily dinged because you didn't have all the information that you needed to be able to fill out the documentation, right? Documentation is important, but there are limitations and there are challenges to documentation in certain instances. It's really more about what are you doing in terms of the process, what are you doing in terms of the engagement, what are you doing in terms of the assessment. Those are the real important pieces, and we back all of that up with documentation, but there are simply going to be instances where it's just going to be tricky to do because something like that may have happened, and use your resources.
Thank you. Anything else? So we're going to wind down if we can. Is there any big components of this that from an EMS duty officer, from the development side, that you want to add?
I think the most important takeaway point today is this process that we really want to expand on. We want to exercise it, and we want to build that into our normal conversations on these incidents so that there's a sense of comfort for everybody, because we do want to be able to downgrade patients with comfort in knowing that that patient is going to be fine for the next hour or whatever it takes. At the same time, we also want to encourage that combination assessment where there's a lot of communication, where we're gathering all the necessary information to make the best decision if it's going to be, in fact, a downgrade.
Thank you.
Yeah, from the development perspective, I think the things to highlight, this was, and I've said this before, it was MRC driven in the beginning. And that's because the MRC exists to make sure that we look at bad outcomes, at bad decisions, and then really try to make sure that we don't have more of those, right? But the decision was made to look at the system, not the individual providers. And ultimately, from the individual provider perspective, the decision was made to provide a tool, right? And so the system needed a standardized and replicable and consistent process for doing this to manage the risk to the system, okay? Providers needed more guidance, and they needed a tool that they could use to make sure that they were making fully informed decisions and that we were essentially backing them up with a bit of safe harbor to say, hey, use this tool. And you can't control all the outcomes, but at least you've done what you need. You've done your due diligence to make sure we're doing right by the patient, right? And then we needed to protect the patient by having something where we're making sure that we don't make bad decisions that could potentially lead to bad outcomes. And so, the major point here is this is intended to help, right? It was QA/QI driven, but really from a how do we help providers, ALS and BLS, to make better decisions, because ultimately that is a benefit to the patients and it's also a benefit to the system overall.
Thank you.
So in short, then, the question that you're going to ask is going to be quite blunt, is
All right, did you conduct a downgrade?
did you complete the downgrade report? Because this was lawyer-driven.
I'm fully recovered at this point.
Well, gentlemen, thank you very much for coming. All of you, thank you very much for coming. Chief Davis, Chief Thomas, we have just a couple more things to say. We want to round out a question that we had yesterday about the relay, some relay stuff, some water supply stuff, and that's really it. So from my point, until next time, thank you. Be safe.
All right, a couple things, just hang in there for a moment. So if you watched the CITS yesterday on the long hose relay, we said we would answer a couple questions. If you didn't watch it, I recommend that you go back and watch it. One was in the 5,400-foot relay, when we dropped that engine in the middle, a question came, what was that engine's discharge pressure? So that engine could not develop 250 pounds discharge pressure simply because of cavitating, taking the water in. So really what that tells you is that we could have done more. We would have needed more relay pumpers, right? So that engine would have had to been back closer to, say, the supply engine. It wasn't so much about developing that pressure. It was, hey, how much water can we move through this whole system by simply dropping one in the middle? Right, and it was kind of like extremes, right? 5,400 feet of hose, that's a lot. Let's just see what you can do with the supply and attack. So that's how that worked out. Second part is we said we would post this stuff, so if the fellas tossed the graphic up there for me. So under quick links on the left-hand side, you'll see most common quick links, and the very top of that is LDH relay testing. And under that are the results of the 3 tests that we did: the 1,800 foot with attack and supply only, the 5,400 foot with attack and supply only, and the 5,400 foot with an attack, relay, and supply. So those will be there for a while. They're also eventually will be put in another location, but they'll be up there for a while. Take a look at it. Captain Liv did a really good job of laying that out, all the scientific approach there. So, Captain Miller, you want to talk about upcoming stuff or not?
Really, I'll tell the same thing that we said yesterday. Early next month, early in February, we're going to talk. We're going to have a boss talk. I believe we decided Station 8 yesterday. It will address both the Garland Avenue second alarm fire as well as the West Deer Park fire, second alarm fire. And then later in the month, late February, don't have a date set yet, but we're working all of the kinks out, really coming to you from ECC. And kind of talk about how all of that works. You know, what is it that they do and how we can use them to do our job better. So, again, thank you.